All right. Hey, everyone. It's Saturday. Welcome. It is Behind the Couch. I am Dr. Shiloh. I am here with Dr. Scott. And we
Hi,
have
everybody.
like basically all nurses in the chat room right now. My dad's here. He is not a nurse. I can tell you that.
But he is very caring.
He has a very good bedside manner. Yeah, we're talking with some of our nurse friends before we got started here today. Shannon, her brother is a nurse, a male nurse. Well, clearly, if he's your brother. Scott, what were you going to say about ER visits and nurses?
No, I had this. I've had 3 of these in my lifetime. An SVT, which of course all the nurses will know what that is. It's a supraventricular event, and each time it's happened over the past 20 years, I've had to wear a heart monitor, and thank God they're smaller now, because it used to be like wearing this whole harness thing that you have to wear for 3 days, and now it's like this little thing that sticks on you, which is amazing. But I had one, the last one I had, where I was like, okay, it's like this weird, almost AFib like thing where your blood pressure spikes and goes down and up and down and up and down, and your heart races and then it stops, and then it races and it stops, and then it's like this weird, completely changing rhythm, like pa 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 pa. So it's really disturbing, and like if you have anxiety, it makes it worse, and they find people who are generally anxious and then have a period of stress are more likely to experience these things. So anyway, that when I went to the hospital for this one, the nurses and the doctor were just so fantastic, and just moving in concert with each other in this small little area that had been, curtained off. And there's probably 6 people in there, all moving around the bed. It was amazing, and hooking you up to all these things and slapping things and oh, you've got a hairy chest, this is going to hurt when it comes off. And I'm like, I don't need to hear that right now. But I think what's funny is they match the energy that you give them. So this one nurse puts a line in to, I guess, get some blood, I guess, because you have to make sure you haven't had a heart attack or whatever. So she's got blood, and everybody's on top of each other, and she trips over the line and falls across me on the hospital bed. And I yelled, fuck. And everything went quiet. And everybody's staring at me. And and the nurse practitioner is at the head of the bed. She puts her hand on my shoulder and she's like, how you doing? I'm like, I'm actually okay. Just need to give me 3 seconds to recalibrate and I'll totally be fine. And then I was fine. And then my blood pressure went down. My heart rate went down. Everything went to normal. And they were like, oh, wow, you're doing really great. You came back. And I was like, well, clearly it was you that threw yourself across my body. Somehow you healed me in that moment.
Right.
With that action.
Or it was a test to see where you go.
Right.
Lovely.
And I apologized for my potty mouth, and they were like, oh, don't worry about it. We've heard a lot worse.
Please. My default, whenever I get injured, it is totally spontaneous that I yell motherfucker every time. It's I turn into Samuel L. Jackson. That is my hurt word. And we were, right after graduation, you might remember this, my husband and I went to Tahiti because it was our anniversary, my birthday, and then we graduated all in the same week. And we went on this excursion where we were swimming with sharks and rays, and I was feeding the rays, and it was funny because everyone had gotten back on the boat, and I was the last person in the water with the guide feeding this ray, and their mouths are on the bottom, obviously, and then open, and you kind of float the food towards them. Well, I floated my finger into its mouth, and when it shut, it was slamming my finger in a car door. It didn't they don't have really teeth. It was just the force was crazy. And so everyone's on this boat waiting for me to get back in, and I'm like, motherfucker. Anthony's like, great, you're the motherfucker woman on the excursion. Nice job. I can't help it. It just is my default. I have zero control over it.
Yeah.
So.
No, I get it.
Yeah.
It's a fear response,
I guess. I don't know. It's just whenever I feel pain that I'm not expecting. So I don't like sit there and
It's
shout that every time I get tattooed or anything.
on a regular basis. So today, folks,
Well,
God, there's been a lot going on in the world, huh?
yeah, you guys are such amazing people because we've had so many people join Patreon in March. Let me read off our new members and then I'll do the raffle, which is for a challenge coin this month before we dive into our topic. So we have Lauren W, Melissa Z, we also have Ava Z, Jen H, Ashley I, Laura K, Emily F, and then today Tracy L. Thank you for joining. March was just, I don't know, people are ready to get on the Patreon bandwagon.
Thank you guys so much.
Yes,
We can
thank
actually
you.
afford new microphones now.
I know, which I'm not even using at this moment. But let me click the wheel here and see who's going to get a glorious challenge coin.
Yes, Esther. More hair masks.
Oh, our winner is our friend Chris B. All right, Chris. I gotta see if Chris already has one. I might have to get him something else. But
I think Chris already got something.
you
So
think
we
he
make
has?
sure.
I don't know if he has a challenge coin, but we will reach out to Chris and
yeah.
see. So you guys were only going to go about 45 minutes, not like friend in real life, Esther. He's just been with us since the beginning. So, hey, Abby.
Oh my God, Abby. Oh my God, Abby.
Oh,
That was
adorable.
so terrifying. No.
Oh, she's dying right now. Are you in Target, Abby? Like, turn the camera on.
Dollar Tree. Dollar
Tree,
Tree
even
is
better.
awesome.
Oh my
Dollar
God,
Tree is
even
awesome.
better. So funny. Well, yes, totally could have been worse. Yeah, anyway. So, you guys, we thought we would focus on kind of a heavy topic today, and it's kind of a jumping off point from
Yeah.
us talking about Alec Manassian last time. The two are a little bit intertwined, but we wanted to talk about mass casualty events and domestic violent extremists. When we have these events, and unfortunately there have been so many lately, I think it probably just feels like, what is happening? How do I decipher the intent of what's going on with the perpetrators? What is the media telling me? What more should I know about this? So that's what I'm trying to hope to bring to you guys today, is for us to really talk about like the different categories, specifically when we're just talking about domestic violent extremists. And I hope you guys find it a little bit helpful. But it just felt timely. So I don't know, Scott, what do you think our folks should be getting out of today?
Well, the thing I would want to do, as with most incredibly stressful events, is try and find if we can benefit from understanding a sense of normalcy. I mean, these are awful events, but you're not alone in feeling the way you feel about it. And yes, there have been more recently.
Yeah.
So if somebody wants to go, oh no, it's nothing more. No, there are increases in these events that have been happening, and they have become more deadly. And yeah, it's let's not minimize that, and let's not minimize the impact that it has on us as, consumers of media.
Yeah. Well, and I bet people, and I've seen it just with everything that I've read, that people's reactions are all over the place, whether people are angry or fearful. I was telling Scott this morning, like, I'm about to go to a place for an appointment where there's majority of women there, majority Asian women there, and I feel a little nervous. I feel like my situational awareness has to be up because these are populations that have been attacked lately. And, of course, I wanted to say, no, you're being silly. That's nonsense. But it's not. It really isn't. Just like after there's an attack at a movie theater, we think, okay, where am I going to
Yeah.
sit now? Am I going to be a little more cautious? It's natural for that to run through your head. I think I'm extra safe in those ways that I think that you should have a plan. You should be aware. It shouldn't totally hinder you from going out and living your life. But a lot of the things that we've talked about before, listening to those gut instincts, being aware, paying attention, have an escape plan, unfortunately, are things that are a reality and will help you survive should, God forbid, you be caught up in one of these.
I remember, Shiloh, you sent out to everybody that's sort of in our immediate group that one sheet about how to assess when you're in a large event or a large gathering. And one of the things that stuck with me from that was to remember that if something happens, if you're at a parade, if you're in a movie theater, strategize how you would get out that is not the most obvious way out.
Right.
So because people who are planning on the most destruction will plan on having someone else or themselves cover the most obvious exit.
Right. Or there's a secondary, that's where an explosive could be or something like that because they anticipate that's where everyone will go, and that could potentially have more casualty numbers to it. So yeah, it's hard to think about these scenarios, but maybe after we talk about the different types of domestic extremists today, it'll give you a little bit better idea to when you hear about this on the news of like, okay, what is this? What am I hearing? What are some clues maybe to what category they fit in? And for us, categories important because a lot of the time we're looking at that for intent, for assessment, and also to understand, which all of that in turn is just for us to study to work towards prevention. So I think I always think about intent the second I hear one of these, and sometimes I'm not as sensitive to the populations that are hurting in that moment because maybe
Right.
they don't give a shit about intent, they're just hurting, and it might not even be related, and it might seem like it's related, but we do learn later on with more intel, and the Pulse nightclub shooting is exactly a great example of that because remember when they were like, oh, he had been seen there, he was a regular, this is some internalized homophobia happening. And when all of the intel came out, turned out no.
It was all
I
wrong.
mean,
Yeah.
it was he actually
It was almost a crime of opportunity
it
because his
completely
first
was.
target, yeah.
Yeah, his first target got thwarted and he literally Google searched closest club to him. So, but it doesn't mean that the LGBTQ community wasn't incredibly impacted and hurting at the time. So anyway, say all that. Scott, did you want to go over some points you had here before we just jump into categories for folks?
Yeah, so like just to give everybody kind of a rundown, in 2019 there were 68 terrorist attacks in the US, and this is clearly a significant increase in the 18 terrorist attacks that occurred in 2008. So if you're looking at a graph, and all this comes from Status, the great statistic websites that are out there that gathers data from all sorts of sources. And since September 11th, 2001, most terror acts that have been committed on U.S. soil were perpetrated by U.S.-born citizens, which just still is amazing to me. Like, it's hard to wrap my mind around it. Since 1970, bombings and explosion type attacks were the most common types of terror attacks. In the U.S., 2017 saw the highest number of fatalities in terrorist attacks since 2001. So, as I was saying, yes, there is an increase. It is happening more often. And I think what becomes confusing is that how we classify these events, mass shootings versus spree shootings versus just violent events that take place. There's a lot going on right now.
Right.
And because of irresponsible gun laws. You know, I am
Sure.
for people. I am for people having guns. I'm also for putting at least what we do about driver's license and car registration in
Oh my
for
God. Yes.
weapons. Like, just why not?
Yeah.
And especially with the most recent one, which is just, you know, so sad that it caused so much destruction, but that, you know, the act was perpetrated within hours of a gun purchase with no background check, no nothing. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And, you know, some of these statistics that Scott just went through are, you know, especially post 9/11, they're not all just domestic, what we would say are domestic terrorism type of attacks. Those also include um, people coming from other countries with intent that fulfill, you know, some ideology that could be terrorist based that we think of like internationally. But we're going to hone in and kind of focus more on domestic um, violent extremists. And there can be both. There can be the people that were born here that are homegrown that then play into an ideology that is international or aligned with an international terrorist organization. And that's a little bit different than what we're going to talk about and focus on today. All right. So there are 5 categories. With everything, there's always a catch-all category. So we'll go through these, and we have some examples that you might remember from history of what this looks like. And so you can start to kind of recognize it when you see it. So the first typology is racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists. So the ideological agendas here are derived from bias, often related to race or ethnicity, and it's held by the actor against that other race or ethnicity. So it could be a given population or group. So pretty clear cut, and of course, what pops into my head is the Charleston church shooting, and that was a mass shooting on June 17th, 2015, in Charleston, South Carolina, in which 9 African Americans were killed during Bible study at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. And among those killed were the senior pastor, State Senator Clemetta Pinnicky, and there were 3 people who actually survived it. And this church is one of the oldest Black churches in the United States, and it has been really like a center for organizing events that are related to civil rights. So it's no coincidence that the shooter picked this church, and that is very common with especially mass shooters or perpetrators of mass casualty events, that they will pick locations and targets of significance, even if those people in there directly, they don't have a grievance against them personally, they will pick it for the biggest impact. And so this is a huge example of that. So the morning after the attack, the perpetrator was arrested. He was 21 years old, white supremacist. He had attended he sat in Bible study with these women before he started shooting. So picture this. You have this young 21-year-old man coming in, sitting down, being welcomed into a Bible study before he then opens fire on these people. And he was found to have, he was found to have targeted members of the church because of its history and because of its stature in the community and what it meant. So just devastating, but also a perfect example of this type of domestic violence terrorist who is racially motivated. There was one that I just found from here close to Los Angeles, where this perpetrator was actually just sentenced earlier this week in U.S. District Court. So Carlos Hernandez, he was 36 years old, and he was sentenced to 192 months in federal prison because he had firebombed African American homes in Boyle Heights, which is just outside of LA. in May of 2014. So it's a long time, this justice coming, but it ended up being a federal case because it does fall into this category of domestic terrorism. Um, Hernandez is a senior member of a gang called the Big Hazard. They're a street gang, and um, his intent was to bomb these specific residences and able to force these families to move away, these Black families. So you can see, I mean, it's not just these big high profile things you're all hearing about. This happened basically in our backyard, and I didn't even hear about it until I went looking for it, and it was fairly recent.
And understanding that although it's in the minority, because it's generally, I mean, as I'm gonna, I mean, this is an umbrella term, but we'll get to it here at the end after we go through these typologies, is that the vast majority of these are white male perpetrators on other races or other ideologies. So this, with
Right.
that particular example, is very interesting that you're giving an example of, you know, two marginalized communities actually in, and there's something going on in Boyle Heights also for the past 10 years, which is a big deal, which is it is becoming very gentrified. So as LA
True.
expands
True.
and more, you know, more economically advantaged people are looking for housing, they're moving into these neighborhoods that are, uh, you know, more often populated by marginalized communities, and that the idea that two marginalized communities would set upon each other, well, not even set upon each other, this that the gang would act this way against the blacks is just, it's very sad.
Mm-hmm.
It's very sad.
Mm-hmm. It is. You know, we were talking about the uptick recently. I feel as if that's resonating with us more because of there not being so many in 2020 because of the pandemic. That we kind of feel like we're like, here we go again. And they're at places other than schools, which all of it's awful. I mean, I don't even know what to say about that. But when it's places of business or a grocery store, um, everybody feels vulnerable.
Well, I think it right. I mean, even Mary Margaret over on Facebook was saying both this and the Pulse shooting are where those folks feel the most safe being themselves, which
Yeah.
is absolutely the goal of a terrorist act. Is you want to instill terror and fear into people. So what do? Is you go to a place where that community would feel the most safe, like religious
Hmm.
institutions,
Hmm.
or you know, or like the Las Vegas shooting, you know, where people were gathering for this concert, this great sort of community experience of sharing their love for music. So yeah, and you were going to go
Yeah.
to the next typology.
Yeah. Just a thought, the Las Vegas one is probably at every training go to, it's the most frustrating because we don't have a manifesto. We don't have any red flag of what this person's grievance was when we can usually pinpoint it with people. Um, and I was in a training not that long ago where the the person who was doing the training kind of pinpointed it in a really interesting way. He said, what the information that we have shows that this perpetrator was such a narcissist. It's almost as if he wanted to do this and not have anyone say, oh, it's because of that. Oh, because it's of this. He even paid off all of his debts. Like he didn't want people to say, oh, he owed a bunch of money.
Yeah.
It was very well planned. And even though that doesn't give us a true answer, he didn't want us to have an answer, I guess
Well,
is,
that feels very apt. I mean, that feels
I
very
think so.
on spot. It feels like the act of a violent, you know, narcissistic sociopath wants to hold power even past their point of life. So after they're
Right.
deceased, they're still placing themselves in a position of power of nobody knows what my motivation is, and it's the ultimate fuck you,
Yep.
even more
Absolutely.
so than somebody that has a 400-page manifesto.
Yes. 100%. So our second category is the animal rights and environmental violent extremists. So, excuse me, they are generally seeking to end or mitigate perceived cruelty, harm, or exploitation of animals, or perceived destruction of natural resources or the environment, also known as ecoterrorism. I'm sure you guys have heard that. There's a quite famous instance of this that happened in 1982 before any of us were kind of really thinking about these concepts. And this had to do with the Super Phoenix, or SPX, nuclear power station, which was in France. And there was a lot of protests going on, a lot of kind of low level sabotage going on when they were building this. And on the night of January 18th, 1982, an RPG, rocket propelled grenade, actually 5 of them get launched at this facility. 2 rockets actually hit it and caused minor damage. Of course, it was all reinforced, like concrete outer shell, but they missed the reactor's empty core. So initially, there were no claims of responsibility. And then finally, this guy takes responsibility all these years later in 2003. And his name was Cham Nisam. And he was actually an elected official. So he was an activist, and basically what they called a militant and perpetrator. He was the perpetrator of this rocket attack, but he had been elected to the Swiss's Green Party, like their version of the Green Party. Actually, it's called the Swiss Green Party. And he carried out the attack. He talked about where he got the weapons. He obtained them from Carlos the Jackal, and some Belgian terrorist organizations were involved in getting him the weapons to launch this crazy RPG attack against this power station that he thought was going to do a lot of damage. I mean, can you imagine if it was functioning and if they had launched rockets at it, the kind of damage that could have been done? But I'm sure they knew it was early on in the stages that they
I mean, in that
plan it that way. But
it's not exactly the same thing. But just recently, last year, the tweaker train conductor who was a QAnon, got to ram the medical ship that was here to help support people with the COVID infections, and he was convinced that was where they were stealing children to drain. He could have, if he had gotten closer, he had apparently built up enough speed where he could have actually punched a hole in the side of the ship with the train.
Really? Oh my gosh, I didn't know it was even that. It just sounded so crazy that I'm like,
it did sound, yeah. I mean, I was corrected by an engineering friend of mine. It's like, oh no, if the track had been closer, right, he could have launched.
Oh my God. Well, I remember here, like east of Los Angeles, it was 2003. Yeah, 2003, because I was still working as a police officer at the time. But there was a local Hummer dealership that was attacked by these eco-terrorists. And basically in the middle of the night, they went in and vandalized a bunch of the Hummers. They set them on fire. They did there were like 18 different vehicles that they vandalized, $50,000 and up a piece, that they just destroyed. And it was kind of a big deal because like when Hummers came out and it was like this big, massive, stupid car for people to drive around.
So
sorry if anyone has a
I'm sorry if I'm sorry. Like you don't have to be a Prius lover, tree hugger. I mean, you don't have to. It's great if you are, but the Hummer phenomenon was something I'm glad it has died down. They're still just as ugly. I think they have an electric or a hybrid Hummer, which is like
oh God, that's hilarious.
Right?
I mean, this, at least they weren't hurting people, and it was definitely more of a demonstration. But it flows with this ideology of what we're talking about, and of course there is a spectrum of behavior here.
Right. It is still violence. It is still destruction of property. Which historically has been part of protests throughout time. Some protests that probably all of us agree with but in this case, I think their efforts probably could have been put better somewhere else. And it speaks of, something could have gone wrong. Somebody could have been hurt in those explosions, the gas tanks, all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Well, you always have also the risk of the first responders being hurt. I mean, you have firefighters responding to this, and someone's got to put out those fires. So I don't know how much they
Yeah.
think about that. God. All right. So next one has some subcategories to it. And let's see if you guys can pick out any recent events that sound familiar that would fit here. So this is our anti-government, anti-authority, violent extremists. So there's 3 subcategories. Subcategory number 1 is militia. So those who take overt steps to violently resist or overthrow the US government in support of their belief that the US government is purposefully exceeding its constitutional authority and is trying to establish a totalitarian regime. And they oppose many federal and state laws because of this ideology I just talked about, particularly those related to firearms. And that's a definition given by, the federal powers that be that research this and deal with this. So that's what they're saying. So any guesses, anyone in the chat, as to seeing that lately, like on January 6th, maybe? I don't know. Yeah, I mean, trying to take over and overthrow the government. I don't know that we've here ever seen a more vivid example of that than we did recently.
Well, vivid and incredibly inept, and I'm sorry to find. I mean, I wish I was not so easy to find humor in this, but this is where my snark comes out. The level, the number of people that have been arrested, and it just continues to mount where these arrests go out, and they are actually complaining about being in jail. They are complaining like, there's cockroaches in here, it's damp, the food is
need
like,
my vegan food.
what the hell? What were you expecting? I guess like I don't know. That's a whole other discussion about sort of the magical thinking about what you thought you'd be able to accomplish and the sort of this grandiosity, almost like of that in a bipolar mania episode, this grandiosity of, I have this special power and insight into what needs to happen in the government and I can make it happen. I mean, it's such a mishmash of mental health issues, including folie à deux. I'm completely convinced that there was like sort of a mass delusion happening.
Yeah, and I think they're having these reactions when being arrested because they just never thought that like, why would they be arrested for it? Because they're doing the right thing. I mean, they're the righteous ones and all this. So it's like, can't even wrap their head around it. Yeah, exactly. So another subcategory of this anti-government, anti-authority typology is the anarchist. So this is defined as basically someone who opposes all forms of capitalism, corporate globalization, and governing institutions, and perceives them as being harmful to society. So anything come up for you, Scott, that you think of, or anyone else as I read that? The anarchists. I mean, anarchists, you kind of think of like anarchy, okay, but when you hear this definition of opposing all forms of capitalism, corporate globalization, governing institutions, I thought of Ted Kaczynski kind of fit in here.
No, that's a perfect example. I mean, it's such a rare specific example. That's a really good, because I was like trying to think of more recently, because they throw around Antifa and anarchy, which the data we have coming in from some of the Antifa activities, and there have been some loosely organized, they and the anarchists have been just as willing as like harming everybody in their path as much as they did law enforcement. And thankfully that was much less prominent than people expected as the data continues to come in. But yeah, the Unabomber is a great example of that.
Yeah, Shannon says anarchy reminds me of skateboarders. Like it is. It kind of
like that emblem.
Yeah, this idea of like punk rockers and skateboarders or whatever. But it's really interesting to hear what that actually means.
Well, don't conflate those two communities, or else we'll get hate mail from
God,
anarchists and
I would
skateboarders.
Never. Are you kidding me? Punk rockers and skateboarders?
Yes.
Oh, well, I'm a huge punk fan, so bring it, and
Good. Okay.
let's do it. I'll see you at the next show when the COVID's
But
over.
your next look, it's you being former law enforcement. This is your next category is like the one that we're going to be actually seeing more and more from, and they are funny when you watch the YouTube videos, but also becoming more of a threat. So take it away.
So these are our sovereign citizens. Um, gosh, there's so much to say about them, and maybe Scott and I will cover this more.
We
Um,
should we should do a whole episode on sovereign citizens.
okay.
Yeah, yeah.
I have a lot. Actually just went to I hadn't been to a training on them in years, and I just went to another one. It was just like fascinating to learn the history as to why the history that they get twisted, to think that they believe they are immune from government authority and laws, and that's a very vague way to put it.
Well, but it has to be because it's so broad. And
It is
it goes back to our term that we use all the time. It's mental gymnastics, because some of these people are smart enough to know they're full of
totally,
shit, but they're
yeah,
still going to get away with it because they know they can gum up the court system and the legal system.
yes. And there, with this whole category we're talking about, there's a lot of overlap. Again, our favorite thing in the world, there are a lot of circles in this Venn diagram, and some sovereign citizens are also militia members, but not all of them. um, and they have not been really tied to any mass casualty events, but their acting out really has a broad range. And as police officers, we were trained with, how to possibly deal with them, because they will refuse to pull over. They believe that most laws, including those related to driving and the DMV, don't apply to them. Meaning, like, I don't need a driver's license. I'm a traveler and I'm allowed to travel. I'm not driving. And they will get into these.
They'll focus on specific words and define them
Oh
the
my God,
way
please look it
that,
up on YouTube.
yeah,
Yeah,
like they make their own driver's licenses out of cardboard, and they just drive judges crazy when they get arrested, and then
it's
I refuse to
awful.
submit to your authority, and it's just crazy.
Yeah, so basically, there's a couple of laws on the books that are very, very old, where they believe that at a certain point in time, I believe it was called the Organic Bill of the District of Columbia. And they believe that the District of Columbia turned our government into a corporation at that time. Therefore, the laws are no longer apply, that are put out by the government. Now, sometimes they will listen to county laws, like the sheriffs, because some of them say that county does have some jurisdiction. It's very convoluted. Again, we'll
Yeah,
go deep into
we're gonna
this
have to do a
later.
whole thing on it. Yeah.
But it can range from, okay, maybe they refuse to pull over, to going to the courts. Did you know that you can actually go to the court and put a lien on anybody's property? And
Yeah.
they will do that. And so if a cop pulls them over, and they will say, okay, you have 20 seconds of my time, and then I'm going to start charging you. Like, meaning they're going to start charging the police officer for their time. That cop may pull them over, nothing's really wrong, they send them on their way. 10 years later, the cop's like, oh, I'm going to sell my house. Well, guess what? This guy went down 10 years ago and put a lien on your property, and now you can't sell your home. Like, they will do all of this bullshit in the courts to fuck with people.
Right,
It's
and
awful.
our laws need to catch up. We've talked about this in other
Oh, yes,
episodes. Our laws need to catch up to where we don't allow those kind of things. But it's life. It destroys people's lives.
it does. But there have been several instances. They get so riled up and they so truly believe in this. There was a father and son team where they would go around the country giving trainings on their quote unquote rights as sovereign citizens.
Also, which
And
means they don't have to pay any taxes.
oh, right, of course. Um, Unless they've entered into a contract with this corporation called the U.S. government. But they have footage of this guy basically saying, if I get pulled over by one more goddamn cop, I don't know what I'm going to do. And sure enough, he and his son get pulled over, and they just murder these officers in cold blood with an assault rifle. It was awful. It was absolutely awful. So they have been responsible for numerous fatalities of police officers, mostly on traffic stops when they're getting pulled over. It's just it's that last grievance that sort of is there on that pathway to violence that Scott and I talk so much about. And unfortunately, it usually ends in a situation like that. But they are a special group that I would love to. I have lots of notes all ready to go for an episode on that. So our fourth category, as we are wrapping up here, is the abortion-related violent extremists. So ideological agendas in support of pro-life beliefs. I always think of Eric Rudolph, even though we know him for the Olympic bombings. He did bomb two of his other bombings were of abortion clinics and killing a few individuals at those. He also did, I think his fourth bombing was of a lesbian bar somewhere down in the South, down in Atlanta, I think. But so many of his crimes and bombings were in Atlanta and Alabama area, but a couple of those were abortion clinics. And we do hear about this, as being quite a risk and a threat. He's just like the person that I sort of attach. I don't know if anyone else has any that they think of. And then we have our catch-all. So our catch-all category is basically all other domestic terrorist threats. So it's where the ideological agendas are not otherwise defined in any of the other categories. They can include personal grievances and beliefs with a potential bias related to religion, gender, sexual orientation. That's sort of dumbing it down. It can be anything. So this is where I see our incels fitting in. This is where I can see our incels who act out violently. I don't want to make an assumption about the entire group. We're just talking about people who act out violently here. Quite possibly our Atlanta shooter, this idea of his sexual addiction, if that is true, of course, probably entwined with a lot of religiosity going on there. That's its sort of like own little niche that we haven't really heard of before. I also would put, probably our school shootings, the majority of our school shootings in these categories, because usually they're not racially motivated or any of these other things we're talking about. It's some personal grievance within the person that, honestly, as much as we study it, as much as we try to understand it, we will never understand it. This is a person
right,
who you have to be inside their head to even wrap your head around it.
Right. And so much of we can like all the information we get from Alec Manassian, even though, after his van incident, that is specific to who he is.
Right.
His end result was a mass casualty, but not everybody else takes that road to get to that same destination. So clearly, some of the things that we look at is like there's a lack of critical thinking skills. There's a lack of self-awareness that intersects with empathy and compassion and theory of mind, kind of having an understanding that other people are more than objects. They are living sentient beings as well. And when some things like personality disorders get in the way and are combined with entitlement and fed by this fountain of ideology that you're being repressed, which is what some of the right-wing media has been doing for the past 20 years. You combine that with other things, it's not a good combination.
No, which is scary because, like with everything, not everything fits into nice, neat categories, and a grievance or somebody's personal reason for going out and doing some of these horrific things can really be anything. And that's the scariest part, I think, for anyone, but especially for us when we're just trying to understand it and study it for prevention reasons, is sometimes it just doesn't make sense.
Right.
All right, everyone. I'm going to put a link here in the chat. If You like the sweatshirt that I happen to be wearing? This is a wonderful organization called Inglewood Helping Hands. And this was a one-woman show for a long time. The woman that started this organization really was helping to try and feed people during the pandemic, and proceeds from the clothing go towards this. She has other things that GoFundMe money can be used towards, as far as like getting diapers for the community for babies. You know, it's pretty wonderful. She's been featured on our local news here.
Oh, that's
Cute
great.
little heart on the sleeve. But she's got some other things as well, not just sweatshirts. And it's like 75 degrees. I'm boiling right now, but I wanted to like represent this. All right, everyone.
I
Scott?
did. Let me. I know you got to rush because you're in total run.
Yeah.
But Shannon just made a suggestion for one of our get vocals, and if we need to do a specific additional get vocal for this subject, we will. Talking about getting back to normal, because I think it is a clinical and self-care issue of how do we get past the fear we've used to keep us safe for the past year in order to get back to a sense of normalcy, and what does that mean? How can we? So Shannon, thank you. That's a great idea. No, it's not free advice. It's like this is part of our, just for us. It's for anybody that watches this, and if you pick up anything from what we're able to offer and go and tell people, then that keeps everybody healthier. That keeps the world healthier.
Yeah,
so
absolutely, great suggestion. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this Saturday. We'll see you later. Bye, Scott.
Bye. Take care. Have a good night. Bye.